Glenn C. Loury is a professor of economics. He teaches at Brown University and is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He calls his new book, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. His publisher, Norton, describes Professor Loury on the flap of the cover. Quote, he grew up on the south side of Chicago, earned a Ph.D. in MIT's economics program, and became the first black tenured professor of economics at Harvard at age 33. He has been at times a young father, a drug addict, an adulterer, a psychiatric patient, a born-again Christian, a lapsed born-again Christian, and a Black Reaganite who has been from right to left and back again. In his book, he attempts to explain all of this. Glenn Loury, you have one of the most unusual prefaces of any book I've ever read. And I'm going to start reading some of it and have you fill in the blank. You say, we're playing a game, you and I, reader and author. An aging black academic economist and conservative social critic of some prominence sits down to write his memoir. He is relatively well known, but not a household name. He is occasionally recognized by strangers on the street, but not every day. If the reader does know of him, that reader may know that he has, more than once, publicly, reversed his positions on a number of important issues of the day. The reader may know that he has endured more than one public scandal. Finally, two more sentences. The reader may know that he has accorded respect in some circles and scorn in others. Perhaps the reader does not know anything about him at all. Please tell me, and there's more to come, why did you write this preface?
Well, I'll tell you that my publisher, editor at Norton, tried to talk me out of including the preface. And I wrote him an impassioned note. I respect John Glussman at Norton a lot. He did a lot to help me produce this book. But I made the case as to why I thought it was important to begin the narrative with that set of considerations. As you know from having read the book, there are many confessions. There's a lot of disclosure of unflattering information about myself as I tell the story of my life. It's not the whole story, but it's a part of the story. Drug use, infidelity, betrayal of friends, craven motives in my professional life, seeking favor with this or that audience when I know that I was being untrue to my deepest convictions and so on. And I thought I needed to start the introduction of this story with a warning to the reader that what's to come is, in some instances, not going to be that pretty. But I want you to stick with me. I'm saying to the reader in so many words, I want you to trust me. I want you to see me in my full humanity. Don't judge so quickly. And here, to set the stage, let me just declare at the outset that a lot of what I'm saying is not going to be flattering to me, but I hope that in being honest with you about this unflattering information, I can, to a certain degree, win your trust, that you can come to see me as a reliable narrator, flawed, but a man seeking to tell the truth about his own life and about our lives in society, because he is reflecting forces that are at work in all of our lives. So it's a way, it's a game theorist. I'm an economist by training and familiar with the analytical apparatus of game theory. There is something of a game that goes on when a person writes a memoir, because they are telling the story of their lives, and the reader ought to be alert to the possibility that the person who is telling you the story is telling you in a way that is most flattering to themselves. So I thought it kind of killed two birds with one stone. It introduced this device of gaming of strategic interaction, of information, of knowledge of the other person's knowledge, uh, and that sort of analytical frame. But it also gave me a chance to foreshadow for the reader on page one that what's to come is not going to be pretty in every respect, but I hope you'll stick with me.
I'm going to read another paragraph, but I first want to ask you, where are you today sitting?
I'm sitting in my home office, and because I'm an invalid, you can see a door that's slightly ajar in the background, which is the lavatory of my home office suite that can't quite close fully because the device that's in there to help me to get up and down from the toilet blocks the door from closing. So I apologize for that. But I'm at home in my home office where I tape my podcast and where I do a lot of my work, sitting at my desk with my library.
Where is your home?
I live in Providence, Rhode Island, on the east side of Providence, a upper middle class residential community in a working class town.
What is your current job?
I am the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University.
How long have you been in this job?
20 years. I started in 2005, so next year will mark my 20th anniversary as a professor at Brown.
You said you're an invalid. Can you explain that?
Well, I've been suffering for decades from pain in my lower back due to spinal stenosis, arthritis in the lower spine. And one of my surgeons a while back told me, I suggest you lose 30 pounds and, get a personal trainer and strengthen your muscles and stretch and whatever, because surgery is the nuclear option. Well, I lost the 20 pounds and I did go to the personal trainer, and the back pain just continued and continued, and had an MRI. And the guy that did the surgery on me told me, he said, "I'm surprised you're even able to stand on 2 feet and walk around, given what I can see of the inflammation of the nerves coming out of your spinal column. We can fix that. Let us fix it." I hemmed and hawed for a while, and I decided, probably I'm in my 70s, a couple of more decades of life, give or take. I did the cost benefit analysis on it and decided that quality of life considerations militated in favor of going ahead with the surgery now, not later, but now. So when a date opened up on this fine surgeon's calendar, I booked it, bit the bullet, submitted myself to the laminectomy and lower spinal fusion and implantation of rods and screws and the whole 9 yards to give me a better foundation for my lower spine. And that was April 10th, and today is May 16th. So I'm 5 weeks plus out from the surgery, and I'm doing okay, all things considered, knock on wood.
Let me go back to another paragraph in your preface. You write, "My strategy is as follows. I know you're going to be on the lookout for anything that discredits my story about myself. A contradiction, a slip of the pen, an inadvertently revealing detail about my behavior. Since I know that you won't be satisfied until you find this discrediting information, I will dispense it for you freely, openly, and undisguised. My bet is that this strategy of self-discrediting disclosure will accomplish two things." And what are those two things?
First of all, it will appease the impulse that the reader has to look beneath the surface of things and to find out what's really going on with this guy, because I'm going to just tell you straight up what's really going on with this guy. So, I'm acknowledging that you're on the lookout as a reader to not be misled by the writer, me. And I'm going to just tell you straight what's going on with me and appease your impulse for a critical evaluation by providing the criticism in advance, in effect. But the other thing is, I think, and I mentioned this earlier, that I buy myself a certain kind of credibility with the reader when I'm prepared to disclose discrediting information about myself, because the reader will think this guy is really trying to get to the bottom of things when he examines his life. It may not always be pretty, but I have every reason to think that it's honest. Because who would tell me this kind of discrediting information about himself if he weren't trying to tell the truth about his life? And so I think in providing the discrediting information about my various frailties and failings and infidelities and uh, surrendering to craven want and narcissism and this kind of thing, laying myself bare, the reader now knows that they've got an authentic narrator here, and that's worth a lot. Uh, I can't undo the things that I've done, but I can present myself in a way that perhaps will, in the end, win the reader over to say, this guy, warts and all, is really trying to come to terms with his own life, and I respect that. I'm imagining a fair-minded reader might say at the end of this book.
How often did you not use the real name of the person you're talking about?
In every instance where there was a extramarital romantic affair, I used pseudonyms, except for one, and that was the young woman whose name is known because our interactions became public when she accused me of assaulting her. It's a long story. I assume we'll get to it. Pamela Foster is her name, and that was commonly known in the news media at the time of the incident. And so I did use her real name, but the other paramours and affairs that I talk about, I use pseudonyms.
Interestingly enough, I have it open to the page of Pamela Foster. Didn't know you would go there immediately, but let's just jump into that story because that seems to be a good reflection of what you're trying to get at. Who was she? What's the incident you're talking about? What were your circumstances in your life at the time?
Pamela Foster was a young woman, a graduate of Smith College, whom I became friendly with shortly after she had finished her time at Smith. She was in her early 20s. I was in my late 30s. I was, this is 1986, 1987. I was a high flying, youngish professor of economics and public policy at the Kennedy School of Government who had begun writing critical essays on civil rights related issues from a conservative perspective in leading magazines like the New Republic and Commentary and Public Interest and so on. So a public intellectual, Black, right of center on race issues and prominent. And Pamela and I began a correspondence with her writing me even as a student with questions and thoughts about these ideas, an African-American woman at Smith College. And we became correspondents, and ultimately we met. And after meeting, we began a romantic affair, and she became a mistress of the married Harvard professor, your humble servant here, Glenn Loury. I rented an apartment in the South End of Boston, which was described later in the Boston Herald as a love nest, a penthouse apartment, nicely appointed, where she was living and I was visiting frequently. And we had a relationship. The relationship fell apart. And in an angry exchange with her at the apartment, I pushed her through a door, not literally through the door, out of a door, and ejected her from the apartment. And she interpreted that exchange between us, in which I did put my hand on her shoulders and forcibly push her through the doorway, as an assault, and reported me to the police as having assaulted her. And I was charged by the Boston police with assault with a deadly weapon, to wit, a shod foot, because Pamela alleged that I had abused her by kicking her as I was putting her out of the apartment. She exaggerated the extent of our physical exchange, but nevertheless, I was culpable for having both created that situation and having dealt with it in my anger and the way that I dealt with it. Those charges were later dropped. I was never actually tried for that offense. She withdrew from cooperating with prosecution after some months. But that's who Pamela Foster was, and that's the basic incident. By the way, this happened just as I was being carefully considered by William Bennett, who was then Secretary of Education in the second Ronald Reagan administration, to be appointed his deputy, the #2 position in the Department of Education. I was on the short list for that job and was being vetted by the FBI even as this incident was unfolding. I subsequently withdrew from consideration for that position, and that added to the newsworthiness of this whole incident. Black conservative withdraws from position and high level in the Reagan administration after altercation with his mistress.
How long were you and Pamela Forrest an item and Foster, I mean, not Forster, Foster, an item, and how expensive was the apartment, and who were you married to at the time?
I was married to a wonderful woman, now deceased, named Linda Datcher Loury. We married in 1983. I met Pamela Foster in the summer of 1986, and we had the altercation in May of 1987, so that was about a year. I was married to Linda Datcher Loury, an economist. She and I had met in graduate school at MIT, where she was a couple of years behind me in the 1970s. I'd come as a young husband and father to the program at MIT in the early 1970s, but my first marriage didn't survive graduate school. We split up, and Linda came along later, and she and I took up friendship and romantic partnership, and ultimately we married in 1983. Linda, no longer living, she passed away in 2011. She and I were married for 28 years, have 2 children, my son, Glenn II, and my younger son, Nehemiah, who are in their 30s now. But I was married to Linda, and I was engaged in 1986, 87 in this affair with Pamela Foster.
When did Linda find out about Pamela Foster?
When the general counsel at Harvard University's office phoned me and told me that the Boston Constabulary had a warrant for my arrest outstanding, that I had until call came on a Friday, that I had until Monday, 9 a.m. to submit myself for the arrest to a Boston police station, or they would be forced to dispatch officers to come and take me forcibly into custody. So it was a courtesy of the Boston Constabulary to the Harvard University administrative structures to make them aware of the fact that one of their professors had a warrant for his arrest and he should submit himself for processing. When that happened, which was the day after, that was on a Friday, the Thursday altercation with Pamela Foster at the apartment had taken place, I had left thinking that, well, we had a fight, but that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning of it. And when that happened, I had to make my wife aware of the fact that I was in trouble. I needed to consult legal services immediately. I was going to have to be processed as an accused felon. Here was the charge. This is what has happened. And I confessed that to her immediately upon getting that call from the counsel's office at Harvard. Now, was that her first knowledge of my relationship with Pamela Foster? The first explicit knowledge. She may not have known Pamela Foster's name or precisely where this love nest was, but I was, after all, carrying on an illicit relationship, which meant that I had to invest time and money in the relationship. And my wife is there living with me, sharing the same bank account in the same home domicile. she had to suspect that something was going on with my late nights and my lame excuses and so on and so forth. But we had not uh, explicitly acknowledged the fact that I was keeping this woman in this apartment in the South End of Boston.
Do I recall correctly that when you were having this affair with Pamela Foster, that you were also having an affair with another woman in the middle of all this time?
Yeah, that's an accurate recollection on your part, Brian.
And what's that story?
Well, that's someone whom I call Keisha in the book. That's not her real name. She was a mid-career professional public manager working for the city of Los Angeles government who was spending a year at Harvard to get a master's degree in public administration as a part of a program that the Kennedy School fostered, and taking one of my classes. She was in her 30s, just a couple of years younger than me. And we took a liking to one another. One thing led to another, and I began visiting her at her dormitory room. She was staying in the Episcopal Divinity School's housing near on Brattle Street near Harvard Square. And we began an illicit affair that I had to keep secret from my mistress, whom I had to keep secret from my wife. This is why I bothered in that preface to warn the reader that what's to come is not going to be pretty, and I'm telling you the truth about my life because I want to get to the bottom of it in my own self-understanding, and because what's the point of writing a book like this if I don't actually tell you the truth about my life?
Are you married now?
I am.
How long have you been married now?
We married in 2017, October. In fact, October 7th is our anniversary, 2017. So that's going to be 7 years in a few months.
What's her reaction to this book?
Loury, my wife of nearly 7 years, a native of Houston, Texas, a working class African-American woman in her background, cybersecurity professional who is retired now, a woman of the left. I think she'd be proud to say, I'm not a man of the left. So we have some interesting political disputations within the marriage. But what was your question, Brian?
Has she read the book and what's her reaction?
Yeah, she's read it. She heard me read aloud draft chapters along the way because I wanted to share, what I was doing and how I was handling different things. Her reaction is excitement about the fact of the book, published, a big publisher, Norton. Had a pretty substantial rollout. I'm doing a lot of interviews like this one and so on, and hopeful about the success of the book. Not exactly mortified by some of the revelations because a lot of it she was aware of in our exchanges and sharing about our lives coming up. Lawan, my wife, happened to be the best friend of my first cousin, who moved from Chicago, our hometown, to Houston 25 years ago, my cousin Tanya. And she and Lawan were very close. So Lawan knew a lot about our family and indirectly about me before she and I had ever met. So she's with me on the self-disclosure front. She recognizing that there will be blowback and there will be, people thinking ill of you in virtue of what it is that you're telling them about yourself and that you're confessing. But when I tell her, Lawan, my wife, that I feel compelled to not hold anything back here, she is okay, with trepidation, with a certain concern about the possible negative consequences, but an understanding of why it is that I feel it necessary to tell the story of my life in the way in which I'm doing.
I like to think of this as two different books. And because of that, I'm going to go to all the way to the other side, which is the substance of your professional life. And I'm going to play a clip from 30 years ago by a man that you know well, Charles Murray, and then ask you to tell us what impact his book, The Bell Curve, had on you.
Bell curve, as all of you know, refers to the distribution of intelligence, which arranges itself in a bell-shaped curve. The first point to be made about the bell curve, one which we do make throughout the book, but which has gotten very little attention so far, is that the vast middle range of the bell curve doesn't have a problem that needs fixing. The vast majority of people in this country are plenty smart enough in terms of IQ to do what needs to be done to get on with their lives. The problems with intelligence and social structure and class structure in this society stem from phenomena that are going on at the two extremes of that bell curve.
As you know, in that clip, he doesn't really get to what irritated you. Would you like to explain to us what it is that bothered you and what happened after that publication?
Yeah, well, I should tell your audience that I was friendly with Charles Murray at the time that the Bell Curve was published. He was a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I was serving on an advisory board advising the president, Christopher Demuth, at that time of AEI on its academic programs. Before being at the American Institute, Charles Murray had been a fellow at the Manhattan Institute before being at the American Enterprise Institute. And I had friendly relations with people at the Manhattan Institute as a up-and-coming, relatively conservative commentator on race and public policy issues. I was known to them. Charles's first big book was called Losing Ground, and was a critical assessment of the war on poverty, basically arguing that we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. I won't try to review the details of the argument in that book, but it was a big bestseller that had a huge impact on public discussion about welfare and welfare reform. It resonated for a decade after its publication. So Charles was a known quantity to me. The project that he and Richard Herrnstein, my colleague at Harvard during the years that I was at Harvard from 1982 to 1991. That's before the Bell Curve was published. It appeared in 1994. But after the Bell Curve project had been initiated, he and Murray and Herrnstein worked on that book for nearly a decade before it was published. So I was aware of the project. I was aware of the controversy. Are African Americans inherently less endowed with the natural abilities allowing them to prosper in American society to such an extent that that factor and that factor alone materially contributes to their disadvantage? That's the hypothesis. That's the third rail. I didn't want then and don't want now to concede that point, and I want it not just because want not to do so, not only because of my ethnic pride as an African American, what do you mean we are inferior, but also based on my assessment of the evidence at hand, in which separating the influences of the environment of one sort or another from the influences of nature on the manifestation of the qualities of mind that are measured by intelligence tests is near impossible to do, in my opinion, so that claims that are rooted in essentialist assessments, Blacks are like this and therefore, and which don't allow for the possibility that, well, yeah, Blacks are like this in terms of their nature, but they may also be the subjects of and objects of forces in society that disadvantage them in very profound ways. And putting a number on how much is one and the other is a near impossible thing to do. And there's plenty of evidence contrary to your essentialist hypothesis. That was kind of my stance as a social scientist. But my visceral dislike of the project and of the book came from what I could see it was doing in terms of playing into certain ways of thinking about racial inequality in the American political conversation. I thought it was very destructive. And I spent years attacking that book at every opportunity that I had. I had a little column in the New Republic on political ethics that I shared with a number of other commentators. Every 5 or 6 weeks, I'd put up a piece, and I'd say I probably put up a half dozen pieces criticizing the bell curve argument in one way or another.
Here are two of your other friends, one deceased. This is from 1997, Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom, on being 1950s liberals, and their book, America in Black and White. Short clip, let's listen.
The image out there with a lot of people is that you're both conservatives because of this book and what the book says. Is that true?
Well, if you make the litmus test of whether you have the voice of the civil rights community in the late 1950s and early 1960s, that is Martin Luther King's voice, the voice of Thurgood Marshall in those years, if that's called a conservative voice, then yes, we are conservatives. But, you know, I don't regard that as a conservative voice. I regard that as the true civil rights voice.
I mean, we are 50s liberals, which doesn't make us 90s liberals.
Your reaction?
That's the late Abigail Thernstrom, her husband, Stephen Thernstrom. They were very good friends. Very good friends. Our son, Linda, and my son, Glenn, was born in January of 1989. And for years, he dragged around a stuffed animal. It was a red lobster. And it was called Abby, because Abigail and Stephen had gifted him with this stuffed animal a couple of months after he was born. They were dear friends. We had many, many dinners together, sometimes just the four of us at their house or ours. And we shared a lot of common ground in terms of our political understandings. But I didn't like their book. This is America in Black and White, and if I'm not mistaken, it appeared in 1997. And it was the culmination of a decade of effort on their part to write a definitive compendium assessing the state of race relations and race-related public policy in the United States in the post-World War II period. If you like, a generation on from Gunnar Myrdal's classic work, An American Dilemma, a 2-volume study that came out right at the end of World War II. They were going to revisit the question of the Negro problem, quote unquote, in American society in the 1990s. What didn't I like about their book? Well, I wrote, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 words in the Atlantic Monthly saying what I didn't like about their book. But the bottom line was they were just too happy to say that the liberals got it wrong on the race front, and not enough interested, I thought, in what are we to do in virtue of the fact that I agree the liberals often did get it wrong, but we still have these people, we still have these ghettos, we still have these jails full, we still have these public housing projects with these teeming populations of people who are not able to participate in the American the promise of the American political economy. And it's definitely linked to our past. It's linked to our past of slavery and discrimination. And we have a responsibility not merely to point out that the National Education Association is a labor union that often stands in the way of improving the quality of education for working class people, or to point out that liberal mayors of big cities who say that law and order is much too much emphasized in reacting to urban crime and so forth, and who are, quote unquote, soft on criminals, have the wrong priorities and the wrong assessments of what's in the interest of their constituents. Not merely to point out that demagogues like Al Sharpton or the Reverend Jesse Jackson in certain poses are false prophets, leading their people on a path that is not going to actually produce the result that they proclaim. Sure, those things may be true, but they're not enough. You're giving up on an unresolved and still open challenge to the society. I thought neoconservatism meant we were mugged by reality and we were going to correct the liberals in their effort to make the society a better place by pointing out where reality contradicted their nostrums. But in fact, it looks like you're happy to simply wash your hands of the whole affair. And I may be, in saying this, being unfair. In retrospect, I expect that there are counter arguments that they could make that would warrant to be heard. But at the time, I was having real doubts about my own positioning on these issues and who the people were that I was in bed with, so to speak. Charles Murray was one of them, and I had a hard time processing that. Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom in their book was another different but related instance of this broader question that I had to ask myself. Who am I? What is my politics? Who are my allies? What am I trying to achieve? And finally, when Norman Podhoretz, the publisher at the time and editor-in-chief of Commentary Magazine, a neoconservative Bible, which I was a contributor to, stood up at Harvard University on the occasion of the 50th anniversary celebration of his magazine and said, "We are all conservatives now. We are all conservatives now. No, forget about neoconservatives. We're all conservatives now." To me, at that point in my life, in the mid-1990s, that was the last straw. I'm not that kind of conservative. I wanted to say to Norman, I wanted to say to Abigail and Stephen, I wanted to say to Charles Murray, to Dinesh D'Souza, to Christopher Demuth and Irving Kristol and all the rest. I'm still a Black guy here. I'm still concerned about the well-being of my people. I want to get it right, but I don't want to give up the game of trying to include African Americans more fully into the body politic.
You warned us in the preface, so I'm going to go back to the other side for a moment. And I'm going to go back to Pamela Foster, because you write a lot about this. And you say, over drinks, we do discuss politics in her career. And as we talk, I'm also working out a game theory puzzle let me read it again. A game theory puzzle in my mind. I desperately want to get this woman up to my hotel room. I hypothesize that she also wants to come up to my hotel room, but she does not want to appear cheap or overeager. If I proposition her too early, too directly, she'll believe I think she is cheap and overeager, and she'll say no on general principles. Game over. Again, as you know, reading this book, you go from the serious stuff to the serious sexual stuff. Why so much detail?
Well, frankly, I think the detail, and there's a lot of detail about a lot of stuff. I tell the reader, how do you make a crack pipe if you don't have one that you bought at the smoke shop? Among other things, amongst many other things of that sort. I tell them, what do you do when you walk into a pool hall? And how do you scan the crowd and figure out what's really going on in there? You know, and a lot of stuff besides. A blues club in Chicago, I try to describe it in gritty detail. You know, the sawdust on the floor, people dancing at their tables, the hookers standing at the bar, etc. So, I mean, this is a kind of a literary point. I am a social scientist, but I like to think of myself as a halfway decent writer, and I think the detail adds a great deal to it. Now, this particular detail gives me an opportunity to remind the reader that I am a serious social scientist, and that, you know, we applied economic theorists think a lot about games. We think a lot about social interaction in terms of the strategic factors that are at play, the information that the respective parties have, the incentives that guide their behavior, their awareness of the other's awareness of their awareness of what they're doing, etc. And I'm just trying to show my chops a little bit as a serious social scientist, even in a playful manner, by correctly analyzing the strategic structure of that particular situation. It's a younger woman. She's attractive to me. I'm a kind of guy who doesn't mind stepping out and indulging himself in this respect. How do I get her up to my hotel room? This is the problem of seduction, and you could put it in a textbook. Let me change the details just a little bit. I'm on an airplane. I'm sitting in the first class section next to somebody who has a Bible open on their tray. I could be an atheist, or I could be a fervent evangelist. I could be a Muslim, whatever. Now, it's a flight from New York to Los Angeles. It's going to be 6 hours sitting next to this person. How do I begin to try to communicate with this person? I don't know whether or not they share my particular religious proclivities. If they do, 6 hours of fruitful exchange could be a good way of passing the time. If they don't, God knows I don't want to sit there with my jaws tight, grimacing for 6 hours next to somebody who hates my guts. And so what do? I begin with uh, overtures which are ambiguous in their character and allow me to plausibly deny the intent should I be misinterpreted, or to terminate the conversation on more amiable terms if that proves to be necessary. And I only get down to the gritty, Jesus is Lord and Savior, may he live forever, and what he did for me in my life, once I'm pretty sure that the other person is on side with me about that kind of a conversation. So the strategic problem of seduction, or of graduated disclosure of genuine intent, is one that has many applications, not just the problem of how do you get the young woman to, how do you ask her if she wants to come up to your room.
Final on Pamela Foster is this paragraph, because it leads to another question I have about one of your relatives. That night I devoured Pamela Foster. I was voracious. We both were. I was enraptured by her. This is the zenith, I thought. This conquest and consummation would be my crowning achievement. If I hadn't before, I had certainly now earned Adlert's Paisley smoking jacket. It could not possibly get any better than this. I'm not sure I pronounced it right, but who's Adlert?
Adlert, Adlert. He's my mother's brother. He's my uncle. And was, during his prime, a notorious womanizer. It was a widely celebrated feature of his persona. He was handsome, he was irresistible, he was brilliant. Adlert was a graduate of Morehouse College, a couple of years ahead of Martin Luther King Jr. in the late 1940s, and earned a law degree at the Northwestern University School of Law, one of very few African Americans to matriculate there in the early 1950s, and had a relatively successful career as a lawyer until he got into some trouble that ended up having him sanctioned by the bar and disbarred for unethical practices, which I never fully got to the bottom of. It was only rumored in the family that the great aunts, my mother's generation of migrants from Mississippi and Tennessee to Chicago, who had become pretty well established by the end of World War II and loomed over our family as matriarchs, the great aunts, and had all kinds of shenanigans going on, which, they were an immigrant population who were trying to make it in the big city. And a lot of what they did was on the up and up, and some of what they did wasn't so much on the up and up. And I think my uncle got somehow entrapped in that, and it ended up costing him his legal career. But it didn't do much to harm his career as a womanizer, which was widely known. And as a teen, a young kid, 14, 15, 16 years old, trying to figure out, about his masculinity and what is a man and what do you do in the world, I looked up to my uncle Adlert and his brother Alfred. They were different people, but they had this in common, and wanted to emulate him. And yes, shortly after I came back to Chicago from MIT with my PhD, divorced from my first wife and not yet married to my second wife, Linda, I had a swank apartment on the near north side in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. And my uncle came to visit me there, and he recognized the potential of this beautiful bachelor pad for seduction, and decided to give me, as a token of his endorsement of my prospects as a womanizer following in his footsteps, his prized smoking jacket, a paisley silk smoking jacket with a matching ascot, Hefner-esque cool. This was my uncle Adlert, and he gave it to me. It was like passing the baton. And so I remark about that in the book. And on the night in which Pamela and I consummated the first of our tryst, I was feeling on top of the world. I was feeling like I had arrived as a man following in the footsteps of his fabled uncle, the womanizer, the player, Adler Miles Cartman Jr. Here was Glenn Cartman Loury following in his footsteps. It was the 1980s after all, and I was a master of the universe. That's how I felt.
On several issues, you're up and down and in and out, and I'll just quote you this from your book. I have fallen away from religion. Why did you have to tell us that?
Well, it's a long story. I hope people will read the book. When I was in trouble with cocaine, there were two things that basically brought me back from the brink. One of them was Alcoholics Anonymous / Narcotics Anonymous, the movement, and the halfway house where I lived for 5 months after having spent 2 months in a psychiatric hospital as an inpatient drug addict trying to get free from enslavement to cocaine. I needed all that 2 months in the hospital and 5 months in the halfway house and 4 or 5 times a week AA or NA meetings and more to accomplish the goal of being free of enslavement to cocaine. And a part of that was the relationship that I developed with a fledgling congregation, a church. The pastor and his wife were personal friends, Ray Hammond and Gloria White Hammond, partners in launching a new congregation under the auspices of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination of the Protestant Black Church. And I found myself falling into an intimate connection with that religious practice and basically embracing the faith and declaring myself born again and accepting Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and seeing that commitment as a vital part of the larger project of reconstructing my life. It wasn't only about drug addiction, it was about repairing what had been lost and what had been broken, including my relationship with this wonderful woman, Linda Datcher Loury, now deceased, whom I've spoken of. But also coming to terms with myself and with what it meant to live well and with what was going on with me that had led me into the blind alley that I had wandered into. So religion became important in my life. On the other hand, and I functioned as a deacon, in effect, as senior member of that congregation for the better part of a decade. But I lost my faith. I began to wonder whether I ever really believed the claims, the extraordinary claims that a Christian is asked to affirm. That a man born of a woman, but nevertheless the Son of God, of a divinity, walked among us, lived and died 2,000 years ago, was raised from the dead, continues to live to this day, and provides a bridge by means of which I, Glenn Cartman Loury, can have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe. That's an extraordinary thing to literally believe, it seems to me. And I found that after a point, I couldn't be sure that I really ever really believed it. And these creeping doubts progressively undermined the confidence with which I was able to affirm my religious doctrine. And I fell away from the church. And that's an important part of my life because I crawled on hands and knees into that church. And I believed fervently for a while. I don't say this in the book, but I'll say it here. You're laying on the beach, you're looking up at the clouds, and you're quite sure that there's the profile of Abraham Lincoln in the clouds, and you see it. You look away, your sandwich, and you look back up again, and for the life of you, you can't find it. And that's a little bit what it felt like to me. I looked away And when I look back again, I could not find it.
Here's another switch of topics. This is a quote from your book. I got visceral pleasure out of watching Trump standing on a stage and hurling insults at smug, self-satisfied liberals and conservatives who had lost touch with the people whose support they relied upon.
Yeah. So, you know, one of my motifs in the book is the cover story and the real story. And that passage that you're quoting is a part of me fessing up and saying, you know, my cover story was, you guys want to dismiss Trump on personality grounds, and yet look at all the millions of people who support him. Whatever he is, those people are serious members of our political community whose reaction to him needs to be reckoned with in its own terms. And it's not enough to say Trump bad, Trump bad, Trump bad. Don't you have to ask yourself, why is it that he's so successful if he's so bad? What's wrong with the structures that people are reacting against when they affirm him as their political patron? And the tectonic plates of American society are shifting, of American political culture are shifting. Trump's victory over Hillary Rodham Clinton in 2016 is evidence of that. His continued popularity, notwithstanding all of what we know to be his flaws, should be telling us something that warrants our attention about what's wrong elsewhere in American politics. So that was my cover story, which is true. I would say it today. I think it's true. But the real story was, I actually liked Trump's defiant dismissal of the establishment, because I was an anti-establishment guy myself, going all the way back to the 1980s when I started writing those contrarian essays about the civil rights movement. And I was told by my betters, you know, the heads of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and of the National Urban League and of the Civil Rights Coalition and of the Congressional Black Caucus in the U.S. Congress, and other Black academic colleagues of mine who were telling me, you're on the wrong side, you're on the wrong side, you're on the wrong side. Get in line, get in line, get in line. I didn't much care for the establishment line on the stuff that I knew something about, which was race and inequality. And I bristled a little bit at their smug presumption that they're on the right side of history because they have a D next to their name. I'm an independent, not a Republican, not a Democrat, but I often lean in the direction of Republicans because of my conservatism on economic and social issues. And it thrilled me, it titillated me, it satisfied me in a certain way to see the liberal establishment get their being gotten the better of by this guy, this renegade guy who was smashing all the icons in the room.
In the book, you take us through the experience of being a conservative and being, I don't know what the word is, not hated, but you were not liked by your black intellectual liberal friends. And then all of a sudden they thought you to be a liberal, and then you were welcomed into the community. And then take us back to where you are now. What was it like to be all of a sudden accepted by those folks?
Well, it felt good. It felt good. A watershed event for me was delivering the Du Bois lectures, W.E.B. Du Bois, distinguished lecture series that's overseen by Henry Louis Gates Jr., who's a professor at Harvard and director of their Afro-American Studies program. In the year 2000, I was invited to give those lectures 24 years ago. And the invitation itself was highly prized by me. It was an acknowledgement that I was legitimate now as a scholar within the African-American establishment to come and give those lectures, because my tone had changed. I had indeed broken with the right. I had been very critical of the Charles Murrays. These are very different people, Charles Murray and Abigail and Stephen Thurston, but I had, as you've called the audience's attention to, been critical of them, and had done a kind of mea culpa, and had begun to shift in emphasis from criticizing the liberal civil rights establishment to criticizing the critics of the liberal civil rights establishment. And this gained me some credence with audiences like the ones for the Du Bois lectures. And I gave those lectures. It was published as a small book. I remember talking with you about that book so many years ago, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. And it is, I like to think, a serious piece of social theory, but also a passionate defense of anti-racism and the need to complete the unfinished business of incorporating the descendants of slaves fully into the American body politic. So that book, based on those lectures, opened a door for me with people in the African-American community and in the broader liberal establishment that had, I thought, been foreclosed. And that felt good. I felt like maybe I can really come home again. Maybe I don't have to live in the wilderness. Maybe I don't have to be that guy that no one wants to speak to at the dinner party, that people won't look in the eye, that they will sneer and behind my back say unkind things, that they won't take me seriously, that I won't get the benefit of the doubt from them. Maybe I don't have to be that guy. Maybe I can come home again, come in from the cold. I wanted to come in from the cold.
So what do you think they think of you today?
Well, okay, my coming in from the cold didn't stick. There was a period, I'd say from the mid-aughts through the mid-teens, when I was a pretty reliable, well-informed, articulate, and passionate critic of mass incarceration, police brutality, and that kind of thing. I say somewhere in the book, there's no blacker project than criticizing America's prisons for over-incarcerating and America's policing for being racially biased, and stop and frisk policing and racial profiling and police brutality and disproportionate sentencing and overrepresentation of blacks amongst those being punished. Don't treat white collar crime and the street crime in the same way. A politics of retribution, 3 strikes and you're out. There's a racial subtext to all of this. I was the guy who was saying that. I gave lectures at Stanford in 2007, the famous Tanner lectures on human values I gave at Stanford on this theme. A small book was published by MIT Press called Race, Incarceration, and American Values, based on those lectures. And that was that guy. But it didn't stick. One of the things that I think accounts for the fact that I wasn't able to hold that posture was that I realized that it was a posture. It was to a certain degree a pose. The conservative instincts that led me to say, okay, there are a handful of police killings of unarmed black men, but there are thousands, nay, tens of thousands of black people killing other black people on a daily basis in dozens, scores of cities around this country. Which is the more serious problem warranting the concern of deeply thoughtful and committed and concerned members of my community? The latter, not the former. And besides, a lot of these incidents, you have to obscure the details of what was going on in order to arrive at the conclusion that the police were just hunting down and maliciously abusing people who were resisting arrest and behaving in ways that actually were causally implicated in what it is that happened to them in their interactions with the police. I came to see that my emphasis on incarceration, you're putting people in prison, was just too convenient because it didn't reckon with what had been done in order for the people to get themselves in trouble with the law in the first place, which was a part of the story. Of course, it's true to be able to say, look, we can't just throw people on a dung heap of human debris and be done with them because they broke one of our laws or one of our rules. They are nevertheless fellow human beings and members of the society to whom we do bear some obligation and responsibility. Of course, that's true, but that can't be the only thing you're saying when you have the depredations of the civil disorder, violence, and criminality that is at the root of much of the incarceration problem that we're talking about. It's not all just locking up people for selling marijuana on the street corner. It's mostly rape, robbery, assault, murder, car theft, and so on. that's going on. And you have nothing to say about that? So I began to suspect my own motives in my pivot from right to left. And the incidents, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, uh, uh, George Floyd, that led to significant disruption of civil order in our society in terms of riots, burning, looting, etc. I felt like my defiant anti-cop, anti-incarceration, pro-Black stance was really opposed. It was really me going too far in my effort to be rehabilitated with what I call in the book the Negro cognoscenti, the establishment, intellectual and political establishment of Black life in America. My effort to be rehabilitated by them had obscured my critical vision, I came to think, in the fullness of time. And I came to become comfortable with the idea that, well, you really are a conservative, which is what leads me to subtitle my book, Confessions of a Black Conservative. And I'm okay with that.
You tell us early in the book the story of your life and where you started in South Side of Chicago, but just to put it on the record, how many different universities have you been a professor, not good English, at? How many different places have you taught?
I've taught at Northwestern University. That was my first job for 3 years. The University of Michigan, where I went to join my later wife, Linda, for 3 years. And then at Harvard, at Boston University, and at Brown. I was at Harvard from 82 to 91. I was at Boston University from 91 to 2005, and I've been here at Brown since 2005. So that's 5 different schools I've taught at over the course of my nearly 50-year career.
How many children have you had?
I have 5 children.
Any of those out of wedlock?
Well, 3 of them are out of wedlock in the sense that Lisa and Tamara, my oldest 2, who are in their 50s now, were born to their mother, Charlene, my first wife, but we weren't married until after they were both born, so technically they were out of wedlock. Alden, my 3rd child, was born out of wedlock via an extramarital relationship that I had while married to Charlene, quite young in my life. Alden is 1 year younger than Tamara, who is 1 year younger than Lisa. And then when Linda and I married in the 1980s, we were trying to get pregnant. She had some fibroid problems, had to have some surgery, but eventually we were able to reproduce. And so Glenn II came along in 1989, and Nehemiah came along in December of 1991.
You say that Glenn, too, is gay and that you had some trouble with that.
Well, yeah. When my son came out to me, it was during his first year in college. He was 18.
At Columbia?
He was at Haverford. My other son, Nehemiah, is a Columbia alum. I said, okay, sure. Love you the same, no problem. I said that. I said those words. But I don't know if I really, really believed it. I don't know if I could stifle the thought that I wish he weren't. Why do I wish he weren't? Well, I know what his life is going to be like. It's going to be different in ways and difficult in ways that I would rather it not be. But that's not the only thing that's going on. I've got some stuff myself that goes way, way back to my own upbringing, again, in which this macho man, get as much sex as you possibly can, brag about your conquest, was the yardstick by which I measured my own masculinity. And if you wanted to say that there was more than a little bit of homophobia characteristic of the culture that nurtured me in the 1950s and 60s in Chicago, you wouldn't be wrong to say that. They were called Sissies. And funny. Oh, he's funny. Uh, it was something to be ashamed of in the ordinary conversation of those who were surrounding me when I was a child. And I think I still harbored some of those misgivings and so on. Uh, so my son didn't fully accept my profession of acceptance of him. I think he thought when his mother passed away a couple of years after he came out of the closet, uh, and there was the funeral, and my family came in from Chicago. My uncle Alfred has a dozen sons. He has 22 children altogether, not the same mothers, but he has overlapping families. He was something of a polygamist, coming along with his multiple childbearing liaisons. This is my uncle Alfred. I won't go into further detail about that. He was a great man in many ways, and a wonderful father, actually, ironically, to his 22. Nothing he wouldn't have done for his children, but he was a polygamist. And the sons are parading by, and my son Glenn is sitting on the front row. His mother lies there in the casket, and next to him is this guy, Rob, who is his partner to this day. Glenn and Rob have been together for 14 years. Uh, and he detects, my son, as they look down on him and his partner sitting there, something of a smirk or a sneer or a look of disdain. Maybe he's reading into it, maybe not. So there was this in the air with my son, Glenn. And he knew about my history. He knew about my infidelity to his mother. He knew about my womanizing. He knew about the famous incident with Pamela Foster, which we've reviewed here, which happened before he was born, but nevertheless, he knew who his father was and had been. And he suspected that, and not without reason, that I didn't fully believe what I was telling him about it was okay about his sexuality. Having read my book, I think he now does understand that I understand. And I think the experience of writing the book and being so honest in it about everything has helped him to see me in a different light and to see our relationship in a different light. And I'm very hopeful about that going forward because he's only 35 years old.
Couple of quick final questions. How are you doing with either drugs or alcohol?
I don't do drugs. Well, I will indulge a little cannabis from time to time under circumstances, but that's the extent of my drug use. And alcohol, I have violated the strictures of the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, which insists upon abstinence for life, and have returned to having a glass of wine occasionally with dinner or a highball. I'm not a big consumer of alcohol, but I'm not a teetotaler either.
And finally, how are you doing with womanizing?
Well, I'd like to say that that's all behind me. I am 75 years old. You gotta allow for the guy's got to slow down after a while. But I've also learned a lesson or two. This wonderful woman whom I'm married to, Lawan Sadler Loury, and I have a good thing. It's grounded in trust. There is no titillation. There is no sexual gratification, to my mind today, worth putting this thing that I have with this wonderful woman at risk. And so, I don't mind seeing a beautiful woman walk by and admiring the contours of her womanliness, but it doesn't move me in the same way to action that would have been. And that's partly based upon hard-won experience and partly based upon a sense of gratitude that I have somebody in my life like my wife, and I wouldn't put that at risk for anything, least of all 10 minutes of pleasure.
Our guest has been professor at Brown University, Professor Glenn Loury, and the book is called Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. And we appreciate your time, sir.
I thank you so much for this interview, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.